This is Internet Marketing.
Hello and welcome to the Internet Marketing Podcast brought to you by SiteVisibility. I'm your host, Scott Colenutt, and with me today is Luke Cairnes, Head of Production at Hightower Video. And we're going to be discussing lessons from 80s TV advertising that you can still apply today. I'm a 90s baby. I'm looking forward to learning more about the 80s. Luke, welcome to the podcast.
Good to be with you, Scott, and thanks for making me feel old straight off the bat.
Well, it's not my intention. It's a throwback. And actually, that's quite interesting already just to start with, because I study advertising and have studied advertising from the 40s through till now. I'm interested in all eras equally, I would say. I think it's that feeling of nostalgia takes you back to your childhood, and there's like a special connection with the things that happened as a child. And so for me, all of those TV adverts that I remember that are stuck in my memory, they're all from the 90s. Before we go into that discussion about the 80s and 80s TV ads and why you love them, maybe if you could just describe to our listeners your role at Hightower Video and what you do in your day-to-day role.
Sure. So I'm head of production at Hightower Video. We split our time really between TV adverts, the modern take of TV adverts, a lot of daytime direct response and brand response TV adverts, as well as plenty of online video content. So promos, brand films, even some sort of internal comms I'm doing a bit of at the moment, but a fairly widespread doing strategy, doing lots of creative production. And really the main focus and the main push that we have is to try and make content which is a break from the norm, really, to try and go against the grain a bit, because we're a big believer, we are all big believers, that content which makes people sit up and take notice is the kind of content that breaks through and resonates.
Start me off and help me understand where your passion for both production but also 80s TV ads start.
Well, it starts, of course, nostalgia is a huge part of it, and it starts from the fact that I was born in 79, so I grew up, and I remember specifically it was Christmas TV adverts as well, growing up through the 80s, and I just loved them, and it's, again, nostalgia plays a big part in it. But rewatching them and having, a VCR, we were kind of the first generation. I say I was the first generation of kids to have a VCR. I guess we got to see those adverts again and again. But really, what has happened over the course of the last 40 years or so is that these adverts have the good ones, the best ones, have remained, and they've become part of the lexicon. Ron Seal's a classic example. It does exactly what it says on the tin. For example, of a more sort of workmanlike TV ad from that era. But they're very special adverts, some of them. And, we'll talk in more detail about why. But nostalgia is a part of it, but pure production and creativity is a big part as well.
Talk to me more about the production and creativity side of things then. So maybe with some examples, you just mentioned Ron Seal there. Are there any standout ads from the 80s that just stick in your mind that you I know I do it with the 90s sometimes, this is kind of a guilty pleasure of like going to YouTube and saying Cadbury's advert from the night. Toys R Us is the one for me for the 90s actually, and going back and Nintendo. That I have that guilty pleasure of spending hours just looking at old 90s ads on YouTube sometimes. Which stand out for you?
Oh, for me, and I guess we have to get nostalgia a bit out of the way first, but also from just the way that some of these adverts they remain and sustain, and they influence to an extent what we do now. But one of my favourites actually is from right at the end of the 80s, early 90s, and it's an advert for Dunlop, which was directed by Tony Kaye, who went on to direct American History X, and it is bonkers. It's the production values were insane. It was over, I think it was £2 million for this advert, which featured massive bald men painted silver and pianos being shoved off motorway junctions, and all soundtracked by a beautiful track by Velvet Underground called Venus and Furs. And that as an advert which stuck with me in a big way. There's lots more. There's loads more from the 80s. The Levi advert in the laundrette, there's a series of adverts from Carling Black Label which stuck with me, which had Stephen Fry singing songs about Abdullah Bulbul Amir. Loads of adverts in that sense. I think really why they resonate, though, I mean, apart from nostalgia, is the fact that they have a real sense of creativity. And what really strikes me about that period is that it was a period where, from, if you're going to be a historian about it, from the sort of the 60s and 70s, a lot of adverts stopped being produced by Americans coming over to the UK and producing adverts. And we had creatives like Alan Parker and Ridley Scott and all these incredible people start producing adverts for a dedicated UK audience. And that was really the start, I think. And that's the real, the power of 80s advertising, is that it was the culmination of all these really interesting filmmakers coming up and starting to produce amazing adverts where they had complete creative control. And that is something really nobody has had in advertising since. So I think that's a big reason, I'm such a big fan.
There was a transition from US-based directors directing UK ad to it being UK directors in the, when did you say, early 90s?
Well, no, we're going way back. So really the sort of the 50s after the war. And there's a really good documentary on YouTube about this, what I'll tell you about later on, called The Ad Men, which is on BBC4. But it really started after the war. You had the classic sort of Madison Avenue ad men were sort of shipped over wholesale to the UK. So all the copywriting, all the directing was done by Americans, and it was all very crisp English accents like that. You'll buy our product today, won't you? And really, with the 60s sort of cultural revolution came people like Alan Parker, people like David Putnam, the Saatchi, they came out from that and really imprinted their own unique British brand on TV advertising. And that really was a cultural shift. And I guess the 80s were really the culmination of all of that. Big cultural and very creative group of people who made some really excellent TV adverts.
For you personally, was in terms of the advertising specifically, does your kind of love for TV ads extend to more general things about the 80s? So remove nostalgia. Is there anything specific about the techniques used in TV advertising in the 80s that also applies to other types of video?
Absolutely, yeah. The thing about the 80s is that it was the start really of where, again, because creativity was key, that expectations could be subverted. So rather than having a beautiful woman taking her kiss off in the laundrette, Levi put a guy being ogled at by ladies in the laundrette. There's other, the rise of the influencer as well. Of course, everybody's fully aware of influencer marketing and the power of that. But really, you go back to the 80s and Cinzano with Joan Collins and Leonard Rossiter, and adverts like that, where they really discovered that the power of using celebrities and bringing celebrities into TV advertising could provide that extra boost for the brand, combining the brand of the celebrity with the brand together, creating a really quite formidable sales proposition.
Are there any celebrity-led ads that stand out to you more than others from the 80s?
The classic one, always the classic one, that was directed by Alan Parker, was the Cinzano one. There's plenty of others. Peter Sellers did a series of adverts which were funny. John Cleese was always popping up in adverts for various things. Leslie Nielsen did an amazing set of adverts for Red Rock Cider, which were done in a similar way to the Naked Gun films. So you had that amazing interplay of language, and that's particularly interesting. That's kind of bringing that into a TV advert. And having that in a format which is only 30 or 60 seconds, because Airplane and all those the Airplane series and the Naked Gun, everything is done so quickly and it's so visual. It's a perfect format for a TV advert, and it's a real shame that TV adverts aren't made like that anymore, really.
So you mentioned the Dunlop ad, and I can't remember the director for that one. What was that person's name?
So it's Tony Kaye, who directed American History X.
Yeah. The reason that was interesting to me is I've only become more recently aware of how many film directors actually start out in directing TV ads. That's like a phenomenon that I wasn't aware of. And you've just referenced one there. And I think you mentioned Ridley Scott as well as you were talking. Is that a way for videographers, directors to start cutting their teeth in the advertising industry before moving on to films? Is that common?
Yeah, it happens. It happens a lot. More recent examples are Michael Bay, unfortunately. Sorry, Michael. David Fincher came from TV adverts. It's definitely, I think, because as a form, perhaps not an art form, but certainly as a format, it's, again, in the 80s, you could be highly creative with it. Less so now. It's much more, the budgets are a fraction of what they were, and the bean counters have taken back control since then. But as a format, it's ripe for being able to express creativity. And if you happen to make an advert which really resonates and is seen by a particular person, it still happens now. I'm struggling to think of a more recent example than Michael Bay. But
I remember Michael. I can't remember if it came up on the podcast or whether I was just reading it. And I want to get to that point in a moment about reading and studying. But Michael Bay came up in conversation for me at some point, and that really surprised me to learn that he started out in advertising as well.
You look at his filmmaking and you can see it. As soon as you realize, you see that the camera doesn't stop moving for a second in a Michael Bay film. If there's not robots hitting each other and explosions happening and everything else, you'll see that. And it's an interesting little experiment. You just watch the shots. So there'll be two people talking in a room, and you can see the camera's moving all the way around them all the time. Any other filmmaker would just have a static shot. But Michael Bay being Michael Bay and having a sensibility of music videos and TV adverts, he's always moving the camera, which, I'm not a particularly big fan of Michael Bay, and certainly not the Transformers films, but it's, yeah. And then Ridley Scott's the same, they all have a sensibility where they've had to capture the imagination in a very short period of time, and that kind of shows.
Yeah, this is really interesting to think about as well, because essentially you need a budget to experiment, I assume. So as a videographer, when you're learning, when you're starting to experiment, you can't risk some of these techniques to find your own style on big projects. You may not have the budget, or you may not want to risk that budget. Yeah. So I assume that advertising, even though there is a lot of advertising budget behind a lot of these ads that you're discussing, and probably was back in the 80s, I imagine that it's an easier way it's kind of small bets. It's starting small and just finding your style before then developing it into longer form.
Yeah, it can happen, and it does happen. I guess it goes broader than TV advertising now, of course, because there's so much content everywhere that I'm working on I've actually worked recently on a short film with a guy who's 26, and we're putting together a proposition for a feature for it. And he's, being 26, he's made 4 films off his own back already. And he's developed his own visual style by working with me on adverts to an extent, but also just he worked for a few years for a pharmaceutical company doing talking head videos. But the joy of there being so much content out there, video content. If you are an interesting filmmaker, if you have a creative sensibility, you can figure your way out. And TV advertising is one method. Brand films is another, even TikTok, if you can get yourself noticed and you can develop those skills and that skill set relatively easily and relatively cheaply.
You mentioned about being a historian a moment ago. I mentioned at the beginning about the guilty pleasure of mine, like spending hours on YouTube searching ads from the 90s. And are there any resources, or it could be YouTube, it could be other resources that come to mind where you spend a lot of your time studying these things? It sounds like you're a real studier of the craft.
I don't know. Yeah, I do. I watch, like everybody else, I watch a lot of YouTube, and it's, in terms of particular channels on there, TV Arc's always a classic for classic TV and classic TV advertising.
Diving more deeply into the specific techniques, so the lessons that you've taken from 80s TV advertising, and you've started to apply to, I can't remember how you described it, but your visual style, the things that you do today. And it doesn't necessarily have to be TV ads that you've created. It could be more general within content that you produce. What techniques have you taken? What are you applying from the 80s that can still apply today?
Well, really, for me, the biggest lesson that I've had, certainly from that period, that was when the creatives were very fortunate in that everybody bowed to them, before and after and since, all the way through. It's really been about the strategy and, the marketing department having control, and also the client's involvement in terms of the client setting the precedent rather than the creative. But the joy of that period was that the creative ran riot, and the budgets were enormous. So the one big takeaway really from that is, again, as I mentioned at the top, is that what I try to do is allow my creatives and me to try and have as much say as I can in production, because the creativity resonates, certainly on TV, but I'd say even more so on online content. I've got a software client, who had to make a Meet the Team video for a conference. And we looked at a lot of the other Meet the Team videos that had already been produced for the conference from various software companies. And they were all talking head videos, and they all look exactly the same, and they're all saying exactly the same things. And you switch off straight away. The patterns there, you just completely turn off. And what I suggested to the marketing manager, who's a good mate of mine, Vic, I suggested to her that we go completely the other way, and we take the people who actually are in the company, the representatives of the company already, and just see what they're about and see what they're into. So we had some sea swimming. We had a guy who was into medieval swords, so we had him swinging a sword around his head on top of a building in Brighton. So we took what those people were and the existing people in the company and what they were about, and we made a film based on that, showing people rather than telling. It's the classic thing, isn't it? So that was the takeaway, and that's what I've tried to apply ever since. And it was really from the creativity of 80s TV advertising, is that you need to show people character, and you need to break the patterns, and you need to break through the beige and create content which resonates and which people sit up and start listening to and act upon.
How difficult is that now compared to how it was 10, 15 years ago?
Oh, well, much more difficult, because there's so many, if you're talking in the context of TV, a bit more than 15 years ago, say 20 years ago, there's only 5 channels. Now there's thousands. There's, of course, the internet, YouTube, everything else. There's so many channels for people to take in content. But even so, the reality is that most of the channels, most of the content you see online, most of the video content is really vanilla, really beige. So as a marketer, as a creative or an agency person, I think it's really about figuring out how to go against the grain and how to produce content which resonates. And that really, that's sort of the ultimate battle between art and commerce, really, isn't it? Because, of course, all the marketing people, all the people interested in strategy, have all their strategy points that they want to follow, and the client sort of follows that. But for me, it's really thinking a lot more about the creative and cutting through.
The way I'm visualizing it in my mind is like maybe there's less creative governance, or there was less creative governance in the 80s in comparison today. Is that your perception too? Is it becoming more difficult because on one hand, I'd imagine it's very liberating to be able to work on lots of different video format. As you were talking a moment ago, you mentioned TikTok and YouTube and Dailymotion, and we've got Instagram, live streaming. There are so many different formats for video. And yet on the other, it sounds like in your tone that there's this battle, or greater battle than ever, for the creatives to actually have and retain some level of creative control. Is that something you experience?
Yeah, absolutely. And the struggle, there are some clients, there are joyous clients who, and I have one that I'm working on a project with at the moment, who get it, or who I can talk to and who get to understand it. To use another very quick example, I'm currently developing a second TV advert for a pension client. And this pension client had a TV advert produced a couple of years ago, which was a guy standing in a kitchen talking about pensions with a cup of tea. And it's just that kind of daytime TV advert, I don't want to be rude about it, that it sends people to sleep, because it's stuff they see all the time. And what I did, I was working with my copywriter at the time, who sadly has passed away since, but has a very big influence on what I do. He just really was very persuasive to the client, and luckily the MD was in the conversation, that you can't make if you're making a pension advert, the last thing you want to do is make a pension advert. You've got to go completely the other way and stand out and do something which resonates. And we made, rather than having a guy in the kitchen, we got hold of 4 giant penguin costumes and went up to Thorpe Park with a stuntman. And on Thorpe Lakes, they have a giant obstacle course on the water. So we had the penguin bouncing around the obstacle course and falling in the water and all that stuff. And that was the basis of the advert, which goes back to It's a Knockout, which was a show which appeals to the target audience. So there was a method in the madness. But that advert turned out to resonate incredibly well and has been very successful for the company,
Aside from the art of maybe persuasion, is there anything that you can do to help business people or encourage business people to leave the creative to the creatives? Is there anything that specifically you do technique-wise to try and make that happen? How do you bring it to life and just convince them to not err on the side of caution?
It really depends on the client, and it really is the relationship that you can build with that client. Of course, there are finance clients, there are clients in very sober verticals where it's very difficult. But then there are other people, perhaps, there are industries which are easier. I do a lot of stuff in home improvement, and home improvement as a sector, they tend to be a bit more relaxed about it and a bit more receptive. But it does help, for me, it helps if that client has happened to have a not satisfactory experience with TV or with online video before. I'm in the habit of producing content for people who have had difficulties, and that conversation is a lot easier because they're frustrated. They think, okay, is this an issue with the media side of things? Is it an issue with the strategy? Is it the creative? Is it what? Is the production? And being able to show them how to go against that grain and seeing how it can resonate is very positive.
We talked about nostalgia at the beginning. It's really difficult to know when you look back how big a role nostalgia plays on your perception of what creativity is today. Do you think that plays a role in how you're experiencing content and TV today? Or is there anything outside of governance that you think just is like the essence of 80s advertising that can still be applied today, regardless of these points related to governance?
Well, humour is a big one. I think humour is sorely missed, and satire, actually. I think there is a serious lack of, and this is, again, it's a broad topic, of course, video content, but I think more satire and more humour is needed. I think there was a big change in the 90s where all brands became much more global in terms of their marketing and their advertising, and I think a big part which is missing is a locality, is a local feel for big brands. Think more locally. It's a shame that an example from the 80s, it's not really a humorous one, but an example is the Hovis advert, famous kid wheeling a bicycle up a hill, which was directed by Ridley Scott, which was a massive advert in the 80s. But obviously that had a real Yorkshire feel to it. There was a real sort of warm, cosy feeling, which clearly resonated very strongly with audiences. And perhaps now, I did a campaign for SanDisk a few years ago, and although it was a lot of fun to do and it was successful, it was very generic in terms of locality. We couldn't be specific at all. It was a global campaign, and I think that takes a little bit of the fun out of it.
It's really interesting that you mentioned satire, because that's arguably one of the strongest aspects, at least historically, of UK humour. It's really unique to the UK, how we do satire. And I was recently in Amsterdam and I went on there. They've got this 4D Welcome to Holland experience, and you go in and it's kind of like a cross between a theme park ride and a history lesson. And the thing that struck me most, I was so engaged that I think the whole thing lasted like 25 minutes. And the presenter, the host of this experience, it was all comedy based. It was all humor. There was lots of satire there. And it kind of struck me. I was having a conversation with my girlfriend afterwards. Like, you would never, if there was a similar experience in the UK, I don't think we would make fun of ourselves and our culture in the same way that the Dutch have in that way. I almost feel like the comedic aspects of our culture become a bit too stuffy. And it's funny because as you're talking that through, I think the same way about our advertising. And maybe the bigger picture is that maybe it's just not a part of our culture in the UK as maybe it was back in the 80s.
Well, yeah, I think it's a lot of it is everybody's terrified of offending somebody. I guess if you're talking, if we're talking about the UK, and this is everywhere really now, you have to be careful and you have to be respectful. A big part of 80s humour probably wouldn't fly now anyway. So, I understand everybody has to be very careful and respectful, but that does take a lot of elements, perhaps, of satire, especially local satire, out of the mix. So there are political, there are sort of socio-economic reasons that content isn't as edgy or as daring or perhaps doesn't resonate in the same way. It's because of the world we live in now. You know, the example of I actually saw in the paper today that there was an advert for somebody or another, and there was a male model with it was a male model who was holding some shower gel in front of his privates, and the papers were up in arms about it, you know, and that's kind of interesting that the example I used earlier on with the Levi advert, which was subverting expectations then, having a male guy, a male model instead of a lady with her kit off, that we're now at a point where it's very difficult to do anything at all without offending somebody.
From a practical standpoint, as a head of production, I talked a moment ago about the variety of video formats that are available to us now in comparison to the 80s. On the scale of being really scared and intimidated and overwhelmed by that to being really excited and liberated, where are you? Is it a lot to learn?
Yeah, I'm 43, so I'm gladfully not getting involved in TikTok. I mean, I am. That's not true at all. I have done TikTok campaigns, but yeah, there's definitely. Douglas Adams said that if you're under the age of 25, I think new technology is something that you take on board and you're native to. And if you're between 25 and 40, you adapt to it. And if you're over 40, forget it. You know, so. As new formats arrive, I'm looking at them with suspicion, but I think it's wonderful creatively for people at home, or for people starting out, or for people becoming successful and stuff like TikTok. You know, I'm all for it, but I think that's where my ship sailed.
So how do you manage that as a head of production? Because I imagine there's this expectation that people come to you maybe for, you tell me, maybe branded content, for example, across different social media platforms or their websites. It's kind of a similar experience in marketing, is that things move fast and it's easy to feel nostalgic about the past, maybe feel like creativity isn't the same as it once was, but yet you still need to run a business, you still need to be aware of these platforms, you still need to find some excitement and enjoyment, even if you're not on those platforms yourself. How do you do that?
You blag it. No, you work with. I work with, again, this chap that I work with. I'm sort of developing a feature with.
Yeah,
native to all of that. So you work with people. You know, if you get to a venerable age, I don't think I'm that old. I don't feel that old. But where there's gaps in your skill set as an owner of a business or a head of production or whatever, is that you bring resource in. Of course, you work with people who understand that. You know, and I do a lot of stuff on LinkedIn because as far as I can see, I can still fit in I can fit into that quite nicely. But I know I happily bring in resource when needed in terms of video production.
You're talking about the 80s here, and I imagine you talk to colleagues and maybe younger colleagues in a similar way. How do you find that they respond to older advertising that you present them with? Are they able to learn the techniques from years gone past? Or are they very much in the moment learning their techniques from the social media platforms and things that exist today?
Well, as with any creativity, really, you know, if you look, again, I'm a student of film from university. You look back at older stuff because that's where the core ideas come from. You know, you look back at Hitchcock films because he invented the reverse zoom dolly, which is the same shot that you see in Jaws, where where Brody sort of becomes smaller and bigger at the same time on the beach. And then the same with advertising. There are staples which are created then, because if you go back and look at a lot of these adverts now, you think, oh Christ, they have aged. But these core principles were created then. So if I show Andrew, for example, an advert from the 80s, he can understand that this is where that particular shot was developed. Right. A good example, briefly, is motion control, which is a difficult concept to kind of explain, but basically where cameras are mounted on computer controlled motors, and they go through multiple passes to allow shots to be replicated and over again. And that was invented in the 80s, and it started in TV advertising. And the same with computer graphics, and the same with After Effects or the precursor to After Effects, the basic graphics packages. All of the things that you see in modern TV advertising in all pretty much any professionally made content that you see online has its roots in technology or technique that was developed then.
Are there any techniques that are left behind that you're glad are left behind and they remain there in the 80s? Again, maybe they remain there in your memory because they just wouldn't work in today's environment for some reason.
I don't know about techniques, but certainly culturally, sexism, racism, homophobia, take a laundry list, of any sort of socially cringy stuff, because it's all there. Technically, I guess
it's less the techniques and more the concepts, maybe.
Some of them, yeah. Some of them are really cringy. But then equally, you have something really progressive like the United Colours of Benetton and their campaigns, which were unbelievably progressive and still are, to the point where you probably wouldn't see them now because, this is a press advert which springs to mind, having 3 actual hearts on a printed page, just sitting there and saying black, white, Asian, or whatever. Something that's so... really, or a newborn baby or something like that. Stuff which is unbelievably provocative is really interesting, but it's perhaps a bit too provocative now.
Luke, it's been a really interesting episode and interesting to reflect on the 80s. You've certainly introduced me to some names and ads there. I talked about being my guilty pleasure, spending time looking at 90s ads on YouTube. I'm going to go back a decade and probably look some of these up as well. Before I let you go, do you want to let our listeners know where they can find out more about you and Hightower Video?
Yeah, absolutely. So my production company website is hightower.video. There's lots of show reels and other good stuff on there. And I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. It's my name, so Luke Cairnes, Cairns on LinkedIn. Post most days on there, so good to join up with people if they listen to this. It'd be good to chat on there as well.
Luke, thanks so much for your time. The links to your company will be in the show notes, and all that's left to say is this has been the Internet Marketing Podcast. Take care.